71 BC. The Appian Way, southern Italy. 6,000 crosses line the road from Capua to Rome. On each one a man dies slowly. Some have been hanging for days, others for hours. All of them were slaves who dared to fight for their freedom. Spartacus is not among them, not because he escaped, but because what the Romans did to him was different, more personal, more calculated to destroy not just his body, but the legend he'd become. This is the story of how Rome broke the man who had terrified an empire. To understand what happened to Spartacus in his final hours, you need to understand what he'd accomplished. In 73 BC, Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator enslaved in Capua. He led 70 gladiators in an escape from their training school. Within months, his rebel army had grown to over 70,000 slaves, former gladiators, and dispossessed. For 2 years, Spartacus defeated Roman legions. He humiliated Rome's greatest generals. He proved that slaves weren't just property. They were warriors who could bring an empire to its knees. And Rome never forgave him for it. After his final defeat at the Battle of the Sil-Aras River in 71 BC, the Romans didn't just want Spartacus dead. They wanted him erased. They wanted every slave in the Republic to know what happened to those who dared to rebel. According to accounts by Appian and Plutarch, preserved in ancient Roman histories, Spartacus fought to the very end. He tried to reach Marcus Licinius Crassus, the general who'd finally defeated him, to kill him in single combat. He failed. Roman soldiers surrounded him. They brought him down not with a clean kill but with dozens of wounds. They wanted him alive. Barely. Just alive enough for what came next. If you're interested in ancient Roman military records and historical accounts from Plutarch's lives and Appian's civil wars, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us continue unearthing the truths buried in ancient texts. Now, let's return to the battlefield, 71 BC. The Romans stripped Spartacus of his armor. Every piece. They wanted him naked, exposed, reduced from the warrior who had terrified legions to just another broken slave. They paraded him through the remnants of his army. The men who had followed him, who had believed in him, were forced to watch as their leader was dragged through the mud like an animal. This wasn't just about Spartacus. This was a message. This is what happens when you resist. This is what happens when you believe you can be more than what Rome decides you are. Crassus, the general who'd defeated Spartacus, had a special hatred for the rebel leader. Spartacus had made him look weak, had cost him time, money, and reputation. And Crassus was a man who never forgot a slight. He ordered his soldiers to take their time. Ancient sources don't detail everything that happened in those hours. Roman historians weren't interested in preserving the suffering of a slave, even one as famous as Spartacus. But the pieces we have paint a picture. Spartacus was beaten, systematically, not to kill him, but to break him, to make him beg, to make him renounce everything he'd fought for. He never did. According to Plutarch, Spartacus died fighting, but other sources suggest something darker. That he was kept alive long enough to see what happened to his men, to watch as 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way. Imagine that. Imagine being forced to watch as every man who'd followed you, who'd believed in your vision of freedom, was nailed to a cross and left to die in agony. Imagine knowing it was because of you. That was the real torture. not the physical pain, though that was immense, but the psychological warfare, the knowledge that his rebellion had led to the largest mass execution in Roman history. The Romans crucified 6,000 men along the Appian Way. The road from Capua to Rome, about 120 miles, was lined with crosses, one every 40 feet. For travelers, it took days to pass them all. Days of seeing the bodies, smelling the decay, hearing the moans of those still alive. It was a message written in corpses. This is what happens when you defy Rome. But what happened to Spartacus himself? History doesn't give us a clear answer. Some sources say he died in battle. Others suggest he was crucified like his men. A few hint at something worse. What we know is this: his body was never found. The Romans, who loved displaying the corpses of defeated enemies, never showed Spartacus's body, never paraded it through Rome, never preserved his head as a trophy. Why? Some historians believe Crassus ordered Spartacus's body destroyed, cut into pieces and scattered, because even in death Spartacus was dangerous. Even as a corpse, he could become a martyr. So they erased him. They took the man who had terrified Rome and made him disappear. No tomb, no memorial, no place for his followers to mourn or remember. Just absence. And here's what makes this even more chilling. It worked. After Spartacus, there were no more major slave rebellions in Rome for generations. The sight of those 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way was enough. The knowledge of what had happened to Spartacus, even without the details, was enough. Rome had proven that resistance was futile. That even if you won battles, even if you humiliated legions, even if you became a legend, you would still end up broken and forgotten. That was the point. The Romans didn't just kill Spartacus. They killed the idea of Spartacus. They killed the hope he represented. They made sure that every slave in the Republic knew that freedom was an illusion and rebellion was suicide. 2,000 years later, we remember Spartacus as a hero, as a symbol of resistance against oppression. But the Romans made sure that his own generation remembered him differently. As a warning, if you heard Spartacus's story tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt when you learned how Rome turned a warrior's death into a weapon against hope itself. And if you want more untold stories buried in ancient history, subscribe. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, especially the ones that empires tried to erase. Spartacus led the largest slave rebellion in Roman history. He defeated legion after legion. He proved that the impossible was possible, and Rome made sure no one would ever try it again. The crosses along the Appian Way stood for years. Long after the bodies had rotted away, the wood remained, a permanent reminder of what happens when you fight back. Spartacus's body was never found, but his story survived anyway. Not because Rome wanted it to, but because some legends are too powerful to kill. Even when you erase the man, the myth endures. But let's talk about what we do know. What the ancient sources actually tell us about Spartacus's final moments, and what came after. The Battle of the Silurus River, where Spartacus made his last stand, was brutal even by Roman standards. According to Appian civil wars, Spartacus knew he couldn't win. His army was surrounded. Crassus had cut off all escape routes. Pompey's legions were closing in from the north. Spartacus had one chance: kill Crassus, decapitate the Roman command, and hope the legions would scatter. He almost made it. Ancient sources describe how Spartacus killed 2 centurions who tried to stop him. How he fought his way through rank after rank of Roman soldiers. How he came within striking distance of Crassus himself before being overwhelmed. Some historians believe Spartacus wanted to die in that final charge, that he knew death in battle was better than what awaited him if he was captured alive. If that's true, he didn't get his wish, not entirely. The Romans wounded him grievously, but they kept him alive. Because Crassus wanted something more than Spartacus's death. He wanted his humiliation. He wanted every slave in Italy to see what happened to those who dared to dream of freedom. What happened next is where the historical record gets murky and disturbing. Some accounts suggest Spartacus was forced to watch the mass crucifixions of his followers. That Roman soldiers held him, bleeding and broken, as 6,000 men who had followed him to freedom were nailed to crosses one by one. Think about what that does to a person, to a leader who'd promised his followers freedom and instead delivered them to the worst death Rome could devise. Crucifixion wasn't just execution, it was torture designed to last for days. The victims didn't die from the nails. They died from slow suffocation as their body weight made it impossible to breathe. Some lasted 3 days. Some lasted a week. And Spartacus, if these accounts are true, was forced to watch it all begin. To hear the screams, to see the crosses rising one after another along the Appian Way. That was Crassus's revenge. Not just killing Spartacus, but making him die knowing he'd led 6,000 men to the most agonizing death imaginable. But here's what makes this story even darker. The 6,000 crucifixions weren't random. Crassus chose specific men, leaders of the rebellion, men who'd been instrumental in Spartacus's victories, men whose deaths would send the clearest message. And he made sure they died slowly. Unlike normal crucifixions where soldiers might break the victim's legs to hasten death, Crassus ordered his men to let these crucifixions run their natural course. Days of agony, all visible from the most important road in Italy. All designed to make sure every slave, every freedman, every person who'd ever dreamed of defying Rome, knew exactly what rebellion cost. The ancient historian Appian recorded that travelers on the Appian Way could see the crosses for miles, that the sight and smell became so overwhelming that many people chose to take alternate routes, adding days to their journey just to avoid witnessing the horror. But avoidance was the point. Rome wanted people to avoid that road, wanted the story of those crosses to spread, wanted every slave in every villa and farm and mine to hear about what happened to Spartacus's army. Terror as policy, crucifixion as propaganda. And what of Spartacus himself? The historical record goes silent here. Plutarch says he died fighting, his body trampled and lost among the thousands who fell at Silurus River. Appian doesn't mention his ultimate fate at all. But there are darker theories. Theories based on what we know about Crassus and Roman punishment for slave rebellions. Some historians believe Spartacus was crucified in secret, that Crassus couldn't risk making him a martyr by giving him a public execution, but couldn't resist the satisfaction of watching him die on a cross like the slave Rome insisted he was. If that's true, it would explain why his body was never found. Why Rome, which loved parading defeated enemies through its streets, never displayed Spartacus's corpse. They couldn't admit they'd captured him alive. Couldn't admit he'd been crucified. Because that would have made him a martyr, would have given his followers something to rally around. Better to let him disappear, to create uncertainty. Was he dead? Was he hiding? Did he escape? The not knowing was its own kind of torture for those who'd followed him. And for Crassus, the not knowing was perfect. Because without a body, without confirmation, slaves couldn't mourn Spartacus, couldn't make his grave a shrine, couldn't turn his death into a rallying cry. He simply ceased to exist. But the crosses remained. 6,000 of them, standing for years along the Appian Way. Long after the bodies had been stripped by carrion birds and weather, the crosses stood as monuments to Rome's vengeance. Travelers in 70 BC, a year after the rebellion ended, would still have seen them. Silent witnesses to what happened when slaves dared to dream of freedom. Travelers in 69 BC would still have passed forests of crosses on their way to Rome. The wood rotted slowly in the Italian sun. But Rome didn't remove them, didn't clear them away. Let them stand as permanent reminders. This is what defiance costs. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. And it worked. For generations there were no major slave rebellions. No more Spartacuses. No more armies of the dispossessed marching on Roman cities. The Third Servile War, Spartacus's rebellion, was the last great slave uprising of the Roman Republic. Rome had learned its lesson. And more importantly, Rome had taught every slave in Italy their lesson. You can't win, even if you defeat legions. Even if you embarrass generals. Even if you build an army of 70,000, you can't win. Because Rome will crucify 6,000 of your followers and make your death disappear into uncertainty and legend. That was Crassus's genius. He didn't just defeat Spartacus militarily. He defeated the idea of Spartacus, the hope that slaves could fight for their freedom and win. 2 millennia later, we remember Spartacus as a hero. His story has inspired countless rebellions, revolutions, and resistance movements. We've made movies about him, written books, built monuments. But in his own time, in the years immediately after his death, Spartacus was remembered as a cautionary tale, as proof that rebellion against Rome was suicide. The slaves who worked in the fields and mines of Italy in 70 BC didn't think of Spartacus as a hero. They thought of him as the man who'd gotten 6,000 people crucified, the man whose dream of freedom had led to the largest mass execution in Roman history, and they never rebelled again. That's the real tragedy of Spartacus. Not that he died. Warriors die. Leaders die. Everyone dies. The tragedy is that his death was weaponized, turned into propaganda, used to crush the very hope he'd tried to inspire. For 2 years, Spartacus had shown slaves they could be more than property, could be warriors, could defeat the greatest military power in the ancient world. And Rome spent the next 2 years proving that none of it mattered. That rebellion led only to crosses and agony and disappearance. Spartacus's body was never found, but his legacy was clear for anyone traveling the Appian Way in 71 BC. 6,000 crosses, 6,000 men who believed in freedom, 6,000 warnings to anyone who dared to believe they could be more than what Rome allowed. And somewhere among those crosses, or perhaps lost in an unmarked grave, or maybe scattered in pieces across the Italian countryside, was Spartacus himself, the man who almost freed the slaves of Rome, the gladiator who became a general, the legend who terrified an empire, erased, forgotten, turned into a warning instead of a hero. That was Rome's final victory. Not killing Spartacus, but making sure his death meant hopelessness instead of inspiration. And for generations, it worked.